Hi, my name's Lauren Epstein. Welcome to another episode of You're Hired here on WERA 96.7, Arlington, Virginia. Today we've got a special show. We are going to talk about courageous conversations and what that means. So in a lot of organizations, I'm sure everyone who's listening has worked, people don't always say what needs to be said. They don't talk about the problems, and they may not even appreciate or acknowledge each other. And why is that? And what can we do to fix that? I think that's probably one of the hardest things at work that I've had challenges with is how to approach someone to tell them something that may not be comfortable or maybe not nice. I don't know. I don't know how we frame it, but we have some experts with us. Today we've got Colin McLetchie. Do I have that right, Colin?
Well done.
Colin McLetchie. Should I say it with an accent?
If you
Colin
can.
McLetchie?
It sounds much better when you say it with the Scottish brogue.
There we go. All right, awesome. Colin is the president of 5 Ways Forward, which is a leadership coaching and team building firm here in Arlington. Colin's a graduate of Georgetown's leadership coaching program and a professional certified coach. Colin dedicates himself to helping individuals, managers, executives, teams, and organizations find their way forward to greater success and fulfillment. He believes deeply in lives worth living, leaders worth following, and organizations worth being a part of. Wow, I want to work there. Wherever there is. Yeah? Okay. And also with us, welcome to the show, Colin.
Thank you.
Also with us is David Abramowitz.
Hi, Lauren.
David is a senior manager with Humanity Forward, which is a human rights foundation that tackles some of the world's most intractable problems. He has worked in the public and philanthropic sectors for over 30 years in the U.S. and abroad. His experience includes 10 years at the U.S. State Department and 10 years working on Capitol Hill. That's exciting.
Yeah, it's actually Humanity United.
Oh, why do I have Humanity Forward? Sorry.
I like Humanity Forward, though.
Okay.
Maybe
I don't even know
5
where I
Ways
got that
Forward
from.
and Humanity United could merge.
Well, you know, we work on very difficult problems, so sometimes we say we actually work for Humanity Disunited. But so I like Humanity Forward.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe someone's going to take that name now, and you've lost it forever.
That's okay.
You're going to be stuck with Humanity United.
I'll just have to have a courageous conversation with them.
There you go.
There we go. So the reason we're having this show today is because about, 3 or 4 months ago, I was at a workshop, and Colin was giving this talk on courageous conversations. And it was really powerful, and he kind of gave this framework for how we at work can talk to each other about things that are difficult. And the reason David's here is because he's a leader at an organization, and I think he can really kind of lend us some great stories and narratives about what are the challenges at work and how maybe he has gotten through some of them, and maybe he can learn something from Colin. So why don't we kick this off with the problems at work, right? I mean, this is the reason that we're here is that there are problems at work. So what are some of the problems that we are finding to be intractable, David? Because that was part of your bio.
Well, I think that there's all kinds of issues that come up in any human organization. One of the key ones is trust and building trust, and how trust can be part of the culture of the organization. Particularly as the organization grows, there's constant turnover. I think one of the interesting experiences I've had is that I've realized that when I began my career, 30 years ago or something, being the dinosaur that I am, that my own personal expectation, and I think it was similar for many people, was that there was you'd be in a place for 5 years, that would sort of show your seriousness in the workplace. And what I've learned, since particularly becoming in management of a relatively young organization that has a very youthful base, is that expectation no longer exists. The idea that you would be at a place for 5 years is ancient history. Being somewhere for 18 months or 2 years, that's doing well. When I lost one of my first hires after 2.5 years, and I thought, I must have done something wrong. People said, no, that was good. 2.5 years for a relatively young person. So I think that one issue that comes up is that as you try to build culture in organizations and you try to be able to have these courageous conversations that Colin will talk more about, this notion of, of being able to do that when you have a lot of changes and people not sure why people left, and just the turnover is tough.
The thing you mentioned about trust is really critical, and I'm sure Colin's going to talk about that. And that's accurate, right? How often in organizations do you get hired because someone knew you from another job and they trust you? Not necessarily because you're the best candidate, but because they trust you. That's very often that people kind of convene together to form businesses and organizations because they have that trust. And if people aren't around long enough to build that trust, then, where are we as a business culture with also a lot of folks working remotely?
And if there's some people that are inside the organization that you don't trust, then it is such a huge setback. When I first came to Humanity United, we had a situation in which both at the executive level and then one level down at the sort of what we call the senior director level, there were people who were really having a lot of hostility with each other. And the corrosive impact of that, the decrease in the ability to have the conversations you need to have, was just really marked. And I spent a huge amount of time in my first year working on efforts to try to bring people together and have a conversation about their differences, which they just couldn't talk about.
Yeah. So Colin, what do you think of when you say, well, what's the most fundamental problem in an organization? You think trust is it, or is there something else?
Well, trust is obviously foundational in every human relationship. The ability for me to say that I can take you at your word, that I can rely on you to do what you say you're going to do, I think really in the workplace is prime. And that's where we talk about accountability in the workplace, that when we want to hold each other accountable, or I'm accountable for the commitments that I've made and you're accountable to the commitments that you've made to me. And when those break down, our ability to have conversation about that is the fundamental way forward in being able to fix that, address it, and be able to partner together effectively to move forward.
Now, that word accountable,
yeah,
I hate that word.
I know I do too. It's
because when I
word.
hear that word accountable, I have an interpretation of it, but what I see in business is that it's a stick that people get beat over the head with. Like, you're accountable. Bam, bam. See, you're accountable. I got this accountable stick, and I'm going to beat you until you do whatever it is, which never seems to work.
Gosh, that's a negative view of the world, Lauren. I mean, I think that one of the things that we talk about in terms of accountability at Humanity United is that it's a vote of trust in you. That we're setting objectives, and we are holding you accountable for those objectives, but it's a way for us to talk about you have the responsibility and the authority. Because I think that, we've all worked in organizations in which you're conferred responsibility, but then you're not given the authority to actually carry it out.
Right.
But
and that's what I'm thinking about. When we're thinking about most people, most organizations that are listening, because I've worked in a lot of places. I've worked at over 50 organizations in my career. And most places are not like your place at Humanity, which is a great name for an organization. They're mostly like, dysfunctional, highly dysfunctional. So Colin, I want you to keep going on the notion of what are the things that are missing in organizations. Why is it we have a certain amount of uncomfortableness, dis-ease with where we work?
So what's fundamentally missing in most organizations is the conversation about the stuff that's missing. There are three types of organizational conversations, and this is drawn from a book called Language and the Pursuit of Leadership Excellence. And
Who wrote that?
Vinay Kumar and Chalmers Brothers. Amazing, fundamental resource that really looks at—
we want some royalties. We just gave you a plug.
Vinay and Chalmers, there you go. But it really explores how language and mood and emotion and all of that fundamentally shapes who we are and how we show up at work and how we get things done with and for each other. And they talk about three different domains of conversations in organizations. The conversations we are having that we should be having, so go us, good. The conversations we aren't having that we should be having. And the conversations we're having that we shouldn't be having. And when you begin to look at your organizational culture through that lens, you can begin to identify, okay, what goes in each bucket? And where's the sweet spot in the middle where we're really focusing on having the dialogue about the things that matter? And in my 25 years or more that I hate to admit of doing corporate HR and deep dives in employee relations, that was at the fundamental of every issue that walked into my office when it came to performance management and they're not in alignment with the culture and that type of thing. Is there was a missing conversation. Nobody had talked to somebody about something that caused the rift, caused the breakdown, caused the misunderstanding.
So, David, how often do you think some of these things are intentional, kind of, which I think most people feel like they're being intentionally hurt versus just miscommunication or a lack of tools to communicate?
I think that in general, it depends. First of all, it depends on the kind of institution you're in. So when I was in a congressional office, for example,
which a lot of listeners are.
There's a lot of hierarchy. There's a lot of competition for influence. There's a lot of belief in turf and what's mine and what's not mine. And I think in those kinds of situations, particularly where the head of the office is either immune to the kind of friction that's existing or actually likes to have competition within their office, which you see in a number of different settings, it can feel very intentional. Even though it may not be exactly motivated to hurt you, it's around what it is that they can do to try to improve their ability to have impact within the organization. So it's a me kind of thing that inevitably it's seen as a zero-sum game. So I think that's an area that the structure creates that. I will have to say in our organization, kudos to Colin. And
I like kudos.
Kudos.
I'll take some kudos.
Kudos to Colin
and
his ilk of excellent HR professionals. But I think that in our organization, we ended up hiring a really top-notch HR person who really started calling us out in a variety of different ways, publicly, but more often in these individual conversations and in terms of training structures and approaches to try to allow us to have these conversations and understand how we could communicate in a way that is more empathetic than it is, in confrontational, which I think would be an interesting word to talk about, is the notion of empathetic listening and how that can actually be very disarming and effective in many different settings. In any case, I think that was a huge issue for us in terms of being able to overcome some of the dysfunctions that we saw within our organization, was having a competent person and someone who we listened to.
And how long has she been there now?
Oh, gosh, that is a great question. I would say she's been there about 3.5 years.
So it takes some time to make this happen.
I think that it took 2 years in before things really started getting profoundly better.
And because we're talking about languaging, Colin, let's talk about empathy. So what does empathy mean?
So empathy fundamentally has several components. Teresa Wiseman is a researcher who is in the nursing profession, and she did research on kind of the components of empathy for those of us who work in those kinds of very compassionate-driven things. And she talks about several components. One is my ability to take your perspective and understand that it is your perspective and it's real to you. So can I tune into that? Can I listen to it? And can I name it? Can I share it back to you? Here's what I've heard you say. Here's what feels like is really important to you. It also requires me being able to relate to, understand, and sense your emotional state. What are you feeling? And so many people shy away from that in the workplace. Well, that's not what the workplace is about.
It's touchy-feely.
Right, it's touchy-feely. It's soft skills. No, actually, they're the hardest skills for many of us, are the ones that scare us the most, that make us most uncomfortable. When we are able to do that, though, that's what drives connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Brene Brown, another fantastic researcher who's done lots of work on shame.
Okay, but wait, what's the value of connection? Because you're saying that all this is good for connection, but why should we be connected?
If we're not connected as human beings, then we're living in the world that David talks about, where it's me, me, me. If I can't get to you, then we can't get to us, which moves us forward as an organization or as a couple or as friends or as parent-child, right? The ability to connect and be with each other, particularly in the hard stuff, is to a large extent the human connection. It's that journey that makes us all similar. We all go through stuff in our life that's really tough. And so when we can get into that space together and I can honor and acknowledge that's where we are, and I hear you, I feel you, I'm with you, and if I'm willing to go feel that within me, then we're in it together.
So I noticed that I remember learning the word sympathy when I was young, but I never understood the word empathy until I was much older, like 20s or 30s. And that the idea of empathy is, in my paradigm, is that I'm not just listening to you, but I'm experiencing what you're experiencing such that you get that I'm experiencing what you're experiencing. Like I'm with you, like what you said.
Right.
And if I can do that, particularly I'm a married guy, if I do it with my wife, it's good. If I don't do that with my wife and I'm not empathetic towards her, she doesn't think I'm listening.
Right.
So which is really interesting. Like I'm listening to you, but my listening is hearing in my head. I hear what you're saying, but she's like, no, you're not. You're not listening. Mm-hmm. You're not paying attention.
I'm hearing,
but when
listening.
I can reflectively say back, here's what it is, and feel what it is that she's feeling, then we can move on.
But there's a functional and operational aspect to it too. So this is a little bit different, but I think is really relevant, which is I had just a recent episode this week where one of my colleagues told me that he was leaving the organization for a variety of different reasons. And I actually heard it through his supervisor who reports to me. And because of a bunch of things that we don't have to go into and aren't really relevant, this was very, very difficult for me to hear because it's really leaving a gap in the organization that's really difficult. And honestly, I was frustrated and angry about it. And then I talked to him and worked it through. And then he did something inappropriate.
So you talked to the person who's actually leaving?
I did. And we had a second episode, and that's really where I want to get to, where he then did something that he didn't handle it very well. He did something directly with HR without talking to me and so on and so forth. And that got me further upset because I was like, why is he doing that? This actually made me look bad, quote unquote. So it was very much a me kind of feeling situation. And so what I ended up doing was when I first sat down with him to talk about this, what I viewed as a misstep, I just said, hey, I'm confused. Why did you do that? I thought we had talked about this and I thought it was understood, and then you did this. So I'm just really trying to understand why you went forward with that way. So even though it wasn't necessarily this person was leaving, I knew it was leaving, but it was this approach to it where I wanted to really hear why he did it. And then that could open up a conversation where he could understand how it made me feel and how it made, I think, others in the organization feel. So I think too many times we jump to, you screwed me, that was wrong, whatever. I mean, I'm being very, reptilian at the moment in terms of how I respond. But it was that notion of, I have to hear his side. I really have to hear him and why he did what he did so that I can then appropriately respond to him. And hopefully in this context where he's a fairly young man, coach him about how this was not really the best way to handle it.
Yeah, I think that's really fundamentally what we're talking about is that we have these reptilian brains, right? We have an amygdala, and our amygdala processes things very quickly. And when we're in stressful situations, like you're talking about, that's where all the decision making comes from, is from our amygdala.
Fight or flight,
or freeze. And until we're like more conscious and aware, and we can think with our prefrontal cortex. We did a show on bias just a few weeks ago. Then we can start thinking about these kinds of conversations,
right?
Where actually, it does matter to me how you feel. I would hope that it would matter to you how I feel.
Right.
And that if we have that kind of interactions, then I can build trust. And that we all, at some level, at a certain point in our life, we realize it isn't personal. Things are miscommunicated. We have a lot of things going on. Sometimes we just make a misstep, right? Because we're just human beings and we're constantly making missteps.
So it's so interesting. I love the amygdala and recognizing that when it's in charge, our executive brain has gone offline, right? It's about at 10% functionality. There's been some research that's shown there's actually a fourth response, which is appease. So fight, flight, freeze, or appease, which means I'm just going to make you feel better so I can get out of here.
Right.
Right. I'm going to say what I need to say and so that I can exit the situation. I'm going to please you. I'm going to appease you, which is also not a productive response. So I think it's interesting. If I can reflect for a second on a little bit of what I heard David say, what I noticed was that there were a couple of missing conversations that would have really helped this whole situation not escalate, not get involved. If he had come to you and said, hey, here's what's going on, I want to share with you where I am, you likely wouldn't have, gotten that hijack and been so frustrated and annoyed. Then when it happened again, it was that missing conversation. He went and did something without circling back to you on the commitment that he had made. And so those are the kinds of things that if we can become more aware of what's missing here, what step can I take that involves the other people who are concerned, we stay out of trouble way more.
I think in a little bit we'll get into some of the frameworks that you're talking about. So my name's Lauren Epstein. You're listening to You're Hired here on 96.7 FM, Arlington, Virginia. Tune in every Monday at 10 a.m. to hear our show, or go to Mixcloud and search for You're Hired Radio. You can hear our show there. You can follow me at Lauren Epstein on Twitter, or if you have a show idea or want to be a guest, reach out to us. My phone number is 240-876-0276, or you can email me at lauren@electriccow.com. I'm here today with my guests, Colin and David. We're talking about courageous conversations. So let's talk about courageous conversations. I think, Dave, you had one with this person. What is a courageous conversation?
So I think there are fundamentally three elements that have to be present for the possibility of a courageous conversation. One is you have to have 2 or more willing participants, people who are willing to actually get into the dialogue, 2 or more caring participants, and 2 or more present participants. So let me just unpack each of these a little bit briefly. My willingness to have the conversation with you is everything. And there are some fantastic books out there about fierce conversations and difficult conversations and all of those things. And they're good. One of the things that I think is missing is the invitation into the dialogue. As adults, we get to live in choice. And so many times we go to have these conversations and we have them at people, not with people. And so when you take the time to check in on someone's willingness and to actually invite them into the dialogue, that creates the space for a courageous conversation to begin.
So give me let's take an example.
Sure.
Right? I got 2 people at work, like David had, and how did he invite, like what can we isolate and say this is an example of inviting somebody to have that conversation?
So to pick up on the example that David gave, what I might have added into his beautiful opening where he was listening to understand, I am seeking to understand, that's where he was starting from, might have been something like, and I don't know the guy's name, so I'll say Mike, right? Mike, I want to check something with you if I can. Is that okay? Sure. Well, I thought we had an agreement that you were going to go do X and, with HR and it was going to unfold this way. It seems that didn't happen. Can we have a conversation about that?
Right. So how would that be distinct from anything else people would pop out of their mouths?
Well, that's a very different way than I started. For example, where I didn't that piece of it that Colin just laid out was kind of assumed.
Right.
I assumed that he was ready to have that conversation. And for a variety of reasons, there were basis for that. But I think that, it's different to jump in and then say, why did this happen? Basically, I mean, I did a little bit better than that, but we really started with, I want to hear your perspective on something that I didn't put it this way, but it was kind of messed up. So, it was more this notion that let's see if we're both ready, because I think, we've all been in places where, for whatever reason, we're not ready for that conversation, and then we should postpone it until we're at a time when we are ready for it.
So you got to be okay with someone saying, maybe in the questioning of, hey, I'm not ready now.
Or I'm not willing to have the conversation.
Right.
I'm an adult. I get to say no.
And if you have I want to have this courageous conversation with you, and I'm starting with step 1, which is, are you willing? And they're like, no. Then what do you do?
I think you can move into inquiry. I think inquiry, and I think that's what David did so beautifully, was if I can come from a place of genuine curiosity and concern, it's like, I appreciate that answer. Is there something that would help you get ready? Is there something we could do that would get you to willingness?
And again, what if they're a no?
If there's a no, there's no conversation that's going to happen. Now, you can continue to share with them, but you're in a space of where you're talking at, not with.
Right.
And that's not always bad. It's just not as a courageous space where both people are fully willing and present to be in the conversation.
So would you say call in a third party, or, if you really needed to have this conversation with somebody?
Well, if you're in an organization, when somebody says, no, I'm not willing to have this conversation, there is some sort of, in my lightly held assessment, trust issue going on. And so I might step back at that moment and try to think about, well, what might be getting in the way of this person's willingness?
They don't trust you. At some level, they don't trust you.
There's some, me, the organization, the life in general, the world and how it works. They could be living in a story about who knows what.
But there's something going on.
But there's something clearly going on. At some point, you can't have a conversation with someone who's not willing to do it. And so one move, particularly if you're in a performance realm, someone's exhibiting some performance issues and they don't really want to talk about it, I think it's okay to share with them, at some point, this is a conversation I really feel like we need to have. And I appreciate and I hear your no. I want you to sit and think about when we could have it and what would help us have it. I'm concerned that if we don't, this is what's going to happen. And I don't want that to happen. I'm concerned for your success here. I'm concerned for your well-being. I'm concerned for your continued employment, whatever it is that you want to put out there. And that can give them something to chew on and might bring them more into willingness.
Colin, wouldn't you say that if you really get to that point, particularly on the performance side, because we have a lot of conversations about performance, the U.S. government, especially in the executive branch, has a very broken performance system. It's not really set up to really improve performance. And so we've spent a lot of time since I've left government I spent a lot of time trying to understand how to do it better. And my basic conclusion is if you get to that point in a conversation, you really failed. That is, you need to be having these kinds of conversations about what your expectations are, what successes looks like, and how it is that I, as a supervisor / manager / colleague, however you want to describe it, can help you succeed in meeting those expectations. And if you get to the point where it's getting as difficult of a conversation or challenging of a conversation as you're suggesting, something's really gone wrong.
So that's a great point. How does a manager who, let's say we're not even at this point, or anybody, not just the manager, but anybody, how do they make sure that they can have these conversations when they do get? It's like having the fire extinguisher, right? You want to have that there because when you need it, you're not going to go out and buy one.
Right. It's too late at that point.
It's too late.
Well, I think you have to – one move that I think is really powerful is to really be thoughtful and prepared if you want to move into a courageous conversation. What is my intention? How do I want to show up? How do I want this person to feel? You can't wing these.
No, going backwards.
Right?
If
and so that's when I think you have to look backwards and say, what's my responsibility?
Okay.
What can I own that and again, to go to a kind of a performance situation, if I'm a manager who I should have talked to David 6 months ago about some feedback or something I was noticing, something I was observing, and I didn't do that. And it's now performance evaluation time. And I kept thinking I was going to, I'm going to get to it. Oh, it's too. And then I have to have that conversation. It's up to me to own that with David. Right.
But let's talk about the preparation in advance. So like my wife and I'll give you an example, is that we will have conversations about how we have conversations before we have an argument. Well, we've been doing this for 11 years. Like, how do we talk about when something happens so that we can get through it? How would I do that if I was a manager or an employee with the people I work with?
I think it starts on day one when you become their manager and you begin to have a conversation about what kind of relationship do we want to have? What's important to you, Lauren? What are you looking for from me? What do you need from me to be successful? What kinds of conversations can we have? How can we have those? What works well for you?
Would you put out there, hey, look, there may be a time when we're going to have a difficult conversation.
Yeah.
How do I deal with that with you?
I would never call it a difficult conversation.
What would you say?
Courageous.
Courageous.
Well, how many people want to have a difficult conversation?
That's true.
Nobody, right? So when
courageous seems kind of non-business.
That's an interesting perception.
Yeah.
Say more about that.
Well, I think as a culture, right, my voice now is, well, what are people in business thinking? Courageous conversation? What the hell does that mean? Like, I don't know what that means. I mean, I think if I listened to Lauren's show, I'd know exactly what that means. I do. But other than the three of us, it's like one more person, and they're probably not even working. Listen to the show. So.
I do think that there is a we have talked about, although I do think we use this language less, is that we have to have the level of trust, the mechanisms in place, and so on, to have the difficult conversations. So we do use that word difficult in this context, but I think that, again, it's this messaging piece, right? What does that mean? Does it mean that it's going to be confrontational and hostile, or does it mean these are things that we need to engage in order for all of us to succeed, and we know it's not easy, but it doesn't have to be those other things. And so it's a partly, a definition of terms, right? And whether the organization is willing to accept those kinds of terms. Because I think you're right. If you think of it in abstract, I pull in Lauren, who's working for me, and I say, okay, I just need to be ready. You need to be ready. I'm going to see if you're ready for a difficult conversation. I think that the instinct is to put your back up and say, oh my God, what's going to happen next? But, in the right kind of cultural milieu, it's okay. And it's more descriptive in some ways.
Have you, David, gone to any of the folks that work with you or for you, you being the manager, and said, hey, look, if this ever happens, this is what we're going to do?
Yeah, I don't think I've had that kind of a conversation, but, we have a relatively small team, so we're engaged all the time, and in terms of the people who I'm directly responsible for. It's harder at the executive level. We have talked about, with my peers, many of whom are across the country, we have talked about, okay, I think I see some rough waters ahead. We have to be ready for some, challenging conversations, or conversations where we're going to really have to bring our whole selves there, or, however we put it. So I do think at the peer level, I've had those conversations. But at the sort of manager, employee level, because I'm in such interaction with them, that it's been less necessary because I put a lot of energy and investment in building trust, so that they're open to whatever conversation we're going to have. And I try to use some of the techniques we've been discussing to try to have them be able to be appropriately engaged with me when we do have to have a conversation like that.
So as an HR person, I've had the experience of asking people, hey, if we have to have this kind of conversation, what works best? And I say 9 times out of 10 people say, oh, just say it, right? Now, they may not do that, but they all just want to be told. Most people are just kind of like straight up, just tell me what's going on. But I've never, and then sometimes when we do, there's, resistance or there's a defensive mechanism. So we talked a bit about the willingness, and then you're talking about the caring, which I think is also really important. I mean, people need to care, right?
Well, the heart of courage, and there's a bit of a pun there, is the word coeur from the old French for heart, which means if we're going to have a courageous conversation, there's inherently got to be something that's bringing fear present. There's got to be some agita. And I have to care enough about the person, about my leadership, about the organization, something that I can hook onto to give myself the willingness to step into that space.
Say more about that.
So, again, going back to many of the times when, a manager would walk in my office and say, it's time for this person to go. And I would start to peel that onion and say, well, what conversations have you had up to this point? What's gone on before? And I get the blank stare of, well, they should just know. Okay, that's not particularly helpful.
David's laughing.
Right.
I'm trying to prevent from bursting out laughing. I mean, I've seen this story before. It never ends well.
Right. They should just know. And I always ask them, well, how would they know? Where would that have come from? And if you didn't backing up to what should have come before, some orientation conversations were likely missing, and then some checkpoint conversations and paying attention to how things were unfolding. And so at that point, the leader has to be willing to care enough about something to own, look, I screwed up. I owed it to you, Lauren, to have this conversation 6 months ago, and I didn't. And that's on me. And so I have to care enough about you to get into that space, or I have to care enough about my leadership. I have to care about the organization in order to be willing to face that courageous moment, to face that fear. Or it may be about you. I'm worried, Lauren, that you're going to react poorly to this conversation. I'm having some angst about that. I've seen you get defensive before.
So I've seen managers the way you're describing, and generally they just don't like them, or they have an agenda. And their agenda is not something they want to reconcile. Because generally when people want to reconcile, they're smart enough to come at it from a reconciliation perspective of trying to fix the problem, of trying to help the person along. But there are times when people just, I just don't want this person here. And that they have that power to push this person out by just saying, I don't want them here. And then it's just everyone kind of falls into line because no one's having these courageous conversations or a break. Like, hey,
right.
Time out. Just because you don't want someone here doesn't mean that, that it should be that way. Now, I want to sidestep here because we haven't really talked about the value of these things. I mean, I get this is great. This feels good. But how does this help my organization and business to be able to do this kind of stuff?
Well, in my view, it's critical for performance of the organization. The amount of decrease in productivity that comes around people being upset, people being said that this person's been unfair to me, the way that they share that information, the way that culture fragments around issues of distrust that build up because of either not having the conversations that you should be having or having the wrong conversations. Both those pieces, I think, there's an excellent way of thinking about it. Those things happen in all workplaces. And the productivity of the organization goes down significantly.
So as a business owner, that's really the key. I'm concerned about productivity. If I don't have these conversations that Colin's telling me have, we're going to lose productivity where things are not going to happen as well as we want.
I think that I've seen in so many different settings where the ability to succeed, to reach your organizational goals have been significantly undermined by the inability to confront issues in a way that will look for solutions. And look, sometimes the solution is that someone needs to leave. That can happen. And I think that organizations and individuals need to recognize that is, it may be a poor cultural fit to have someone in your organization, and you have to deal with that. Or someone may come to the organization with an expectation, and I think this is really key in the hiring side. They may come to the organization with an expectation and then find out that the situation is different, and they just are not going to perform well in those kinds of settings. So, I think that there are a whole bunch of different reasons why it may be necessary for someone to go. But if you haven't really tried to work through things particularly, before it gets to that point, then I think the entire productivity of the organization can be really seriously undermined. And I've seen that across my career.
Yeah, Zappos will pay people $2,000 to leave the organization, which is a great incentive to get people out who really don't want to be there. Colin, what do you think some of the other kind of costs are of not having these conversations, not doing this kind of work? You see this. You have clients who do this work with you.
I think that one of the unspoken, unacknowledged costs is the amount of energy and angst that we carry, and that distracts us from being focused and productive. To get at what David is talking about, these live inside of us. If I haven't had a conversation with David or with you, Lauren, or anybody in my organization, and it's weighing on me, that is distracting me from being focused on what I should be doing. And so I think that's one of the deep criminals that people don't usually talk about, is just the amount of energy and lack of focus and drain on my spirit and willingness to show up at work. I just don't want to go to that place anymore because I might have to have that conversation with that person. Whereas if you just had it and started down the journey, I love how Susan Scott puts it in Fierce Conversations when she says, look, no one conversation is guaranteed to change a life, a relationship, an organization. Any single conversation can. And so there's the space for possibility of change and growth and learning and progress that simply is present, that isn't otherwise. And so when we carry just all this angst and this weight, and we're not as good.
Yeah, and I would just add to that is that a lot of strife in people's lives comes from conflict in their family. If I'm having a hard time at work, who do I talk about it with? I talk about it with my wife. I take it out on the kids. I take it out on the dog. And then you have this, feedback loop of more stress, and the wife is worried or the husband's worried that things aren't going well. Right. And you have this negative feedback at home, which is for a lot of people more important than at work, right? But work is important to kind of pay the bills.
Yeah, there's a powerful ripple effect,
right,
that begins to happen. So if your wife is worried about you at work, she's less focused on the kids or her own job or whatever it is that's important to her. And so there's just this ripple effect that can happen and begins to spread out.
I think that this is obviously another dimension of loss of productivity, but I think that if you're unwilling, or for example, if you're an employee and you're concerned about meeting your objectives, but you can't really have that conversation with your manager for whatever reason, trust issues, or there's check-ins not for a long time, you don't want to bother them, it can really undermine your ability to succeed and the organization to succeed, because as a manager, it's part of my job to make sure that you do succeed as an employee. And there are things that I can do as a manager that you can never do. It may be that it turns out that the environment has changed in ways that I don't fully appreciate, and we have to rescope goals because you can't succeed in the same way with the resources that you have. Or there may be an inter-organizational piece where you just can't do anything about it, but you're afraid that you'll look like a failure to your boss if you don't come forward to it. Whereas if you could overcome those, if you're prepared to have those conversations like, listen, I just can't make things happen because of X, then, you can, as a manager, you can try to figure out how to help that person succeed, and the organization becomes better. I had this situation the other day where, one of a junior employee who's on another team said to me, gosh, I'm really worried about this. And she was willing to, talk about some dysfunction she saw within the organization. And I just could say to her, oh, I can fix that. I know how to fix that. We have to strategize about it. I'm not saying it's easy to do it, but let's talk about it and I can make it happen. If she had never said that, then she would have just been lingering in this space that Colin was, I think, so aptly describing. And so I think that willingness, that ability to create a culture where you can have those conversations is key.
But
to
from your end,
success.
what would you say? How would you characterize? Like, I'll give it a number on a scale of 1 to 10. What was your level of trust with her from you?
Meaning my trust in her?
Yeah,
I'd say it was about a 7 or 8, maybe.
Yeah, on the high side.
Because I don't work with her that often, so I couldn't say it was a 9 or 10, which is where I am with my own stuff.
but she felt that you were a 10 or close to a 10. Like she felt like I could trust you enough to say this.
I don't know. I would never call myself a 10, but she must have thought that
Linda
I
would
was,
say you're a 10.
Well, yeah, she's very biased. That's my wife. But she's very biased. But I think that she saw me as someone who she could confide in.
Right.
And I guess trust is the right word there. But I think there's something also beyond trust. Maybe this is just part of trust, so Colin might have a different view. But I'm a person who I don't like to sit on my hands. I want to make things happen. So I think part of it is that the person not only trusts you in that you'll hear that person, you'll hear what is being said, but that you can actually do something about it, or you're going to be willing to do something about it. Because why would you put yourself out there and say something's wrong with our organization unless you thought this person could actually do something that could be constructive?
Right. So I want to go back to Colin now because we talked about the willingness, the caring, and then you said being present. And I know we've kind of touched on it, but and I want to kind of get down to some of the nuts and bolts, the fundamentals of like, how do I have a conversation that's courageous? So why don't you, pick up on the beginning of this and then bring us down to the being present. And what would a courageous conversation, in fact, you could even have one with one of us. What would it look like so that the listener can go like, oh, okay, I get it.
So first, you have to spend some time preparing. And I like to think about preparation as what do I need to do to prepare? What do I need to do to get ready? What do I need to do to be engaged? So preparation has 3 components. So when I'm thinking about, Lorne, if I'm frustrated with you about how
So let's have it. Let's have the conversation. Pick one of us and let's do it. Because the concepts are one thing, but when you do it, people get it.
Sure. So if I have done my work ahead of time and I'm ready to have this conversation, how I might open it with you is, Lorne, you and I had agreed that I would come on the show here at noon today, and I wanted to talk to you about how things kind of led up here. Is that a conversation you and I can have?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So now I have your willingness.
Yes.
Now you're here. So I noticed that things felt a little uncertain, and I wasn't sure if that was on my end or your end. I'm not sure our communication was as effective as it could have been. I'm curious what your perspective is on that.
Well, my perspective was that I'd sent emails out earlier confirming all the guests, and I sent an email to you, and I have 15 guests today. And then I was doing an inventory of all the people who hadn't sent back their bios, and I saw you hadn't sent it back. So I was kind of concerned, are you really set? Are you really ready? So that's why I called you this morning, thinking, in a bit of a panic because it's in the morning. I have to get ready for today and get here by 9:45. So that was what was going on in my mind.
Gotcha. Really helpful to know. I completely missed that bio request. I think it was a kind of a hidden request later in the email, and I was scanning it on my phone. So now I know where the breakdown happened. Thank you for sharing your perspective. Next time I can pay greater attention to when your emails come.
Yeah, and I think from our perspective that we're going to probably make it a little more automated and send something out from a Google Doc so that you're just putting the data into a Google Doc and you don't have to send us back the form. Because we've had, over the months, people will sometimes send it back in a way that we can't necessarily use it. So.
Great. May I give you a couple of other suggestions?
Yes.
See, so now we're in dialogue, and I'm not noticing any great angst in me, and I'm not sensing any in you. No. And yet we're talking
I don't feel
about,
attacked.
Right.
I don't feel like you've said anything that is pejorative to my show or me
right.
Or my people.
Right.
But you've made it clear that you want to be supportive.
Exactly. I care about you. I care about this experience, and you can sense that because – and I didn't really take a lot of time to prepare for it, but I did take a quick second to say, all right, how do I want to show up here? And you may have heard that pause before we got started. That was me checking into my own engagement, taking the deep breath and going, all right, let's go here. I can do this. We can do this.
Right. And with me being a willing partner, I have an stakeness in this turning out really well, so I can collaborate with you on ideas. And we've noticed that problem, and we need to fix it. Just because it's not just you, it happens.
Right. Right.
And it's never just you, right? Whenever there's a problem, it's never that one person. It's probably happening with other people, whatever it is.
Whatever it is. It may or it may not. That would be an interesting scan to do after the conversation.
So, Dave, how would you given that we've now just gotten trained by the most professional, courageous conversation person in the world, right? What have you taken away from this that you might bring to your next courageous conversation?
I think that the two responses that you guys talked about in terms of not just fight or flight, but also freeze, which happens less often in our workplace because we're a very action-oriented, high-functioning organization. But I think the appease notion that you need to be super careful that when you're in conversation with someone that you're really going one level down and making sure that this person is not just appeasing me is something that I've seen myself do but haven't really named it. And I just want to really be aware of as we go forward how I can design conversations to try to unravel what's really happening if there's difficult issues. So that's one piece that struck me in terms of things that I need to be more mindful of.
I think, fundamentally, if we don't have what we're taking away from this conversation, if we don't have these conversations, if we don't have the structure set up for them, we're going to have lower productivity at work, higher turnover, higher absenteeism. Probably all the bad things that can happen to a company will have. Maybe even embezzlement, people stealing funds outright or stealing time or stealing resources, that there's not that relationship where we're all committed to the same thing. Like in that little interaction, what I noticed and when I have these kind of conversations with people is that, hey, I'm committed to your success. You're committed to my success. We know that it's already a done deal. Now, there are a lot of conversations, I've sat in the HR seat that are kind of difficult and kind of personal. Like there was one organization I worked at where one of the employees was not appreciated by any of the other employees. They all felt that this person was superfluous and just really shouldn't have been there. And what we didn't do and what I didn't do is really take on my leadership to have those conversations with them all along. Like, and that person thought that they were doing a great job. They were getting a lot of exposure and getting, but then it all kind of tumbled down. And I think we did a disservice by not having those conversations. And I didn't feel like we could because I didn't feel that the management would support it, that the management didn't ever really have direct, honest conversations with anyone about anything.
You can't address something you don't know anything about, that's for sure.
You can't address something that you don't know anything about. And that's a great takeaway for the folks who are business owners and leaders, is that it really is important for you to know what's going on in your business.
Well, and as I'm listening to the example that you just gave, Lauren, I'm hearing another opportunity for a conversation that was missing, which was your courageous conversation upward to say, I feel like I need to have some pretty direct dialogue with someone, and I'm noticing that I don't feel like you may have my back if I go here. Can we have a conversation about that?
And I think that's probably why I don't work there anymore.
Right. Which I think powerfully goes to what you were kind of talking about with David in terms of trust. I really love that she came to you, that colleague came to you and said, God, I'm really wrestling with this. She may have had zero trust in David. And it could be just that the pain got so bad that she was willing to go out on the limb. When the pain gets that bad, what most people do, many people do, especially if they're fleers or freezers, is they leave the organization.
Right.
They don't have the conversation. And so I think that's just a really prime example of, she could see a lot of trust in David, or it could just be, it was painful enough that I had to say something, whatever the risks. And that's when people make those conscious decisions, I think they're in a better place to have a courageous conversation. If I can consciously say, you know what, I'm not going to have a conversation about this, I'm going to choose to let it go, then I can work on the letting it go. Or I can say, I have to have this because the pain of not having this conversation is greater than the fear and the pain of having it.
I think this is it's a great conversation to have, in that I wish I had managers who would be willing to have those kind of conversations with me. And I think anyone who's listening to this show needs to get engaged with, how do I have conversations with my managers, my employees, my colleagues that support the organization, where we get to a place where things are better. Because what you said, what I took away was that this conversation, any conversation, is a possibility. It's just a possibility, which is a blank space that anything can go into. What do we want to put into it? And we know that we're putting good stuff into it if the end result is that the company is more productive, and that we don't write people off. I think that's another thing. Even when you have to let someone go, there are systems in a lot of companies that allow people a safe exit, right? We need to say, okay, if it's not a fit, which happens, here's a safe exit. We give you some money to go. We don't, disparage you, and it's a win. So, and we're gonna wrap up in a minute here, but David, if people want to reach out to you, how can they get a hold of you?
Sure. You can send an email to my personal address if it's non-HU related, David Abramowitz, all one word, ABRAMOWITZ @hotmail.com. Or you can call me, 571-294-0079. Awesome. And I should say, the one thing we didn't talk about is that it's really impossible to have many of these conversations by email.
Right.
So often you see people defaulting to email as a way of trying to communicate. It is almost always a disaster. So the email thing came up in one of our previous. I just wanted to highlight that.
This has got to happen in person.
It's got to happen in person.
Face to face.
You've got to develop the energy and the skill set to do it in person, or you're just not going to have the same kind of success.
And Colin, how can people reach out to you?
So feel free to give me a call at 404-668-6815, or you can email me at Colin, Colin, at fivewaysforward.com. And 5 is spelled out F-I-V-E.
Awesome. I want to thank my guests, David and Colin, for having a conversation about courageous conversations, how you can have conversations at work that make your organizations more effective, your relationships more powerful, your businesses really grow. And you're listening to You're Hired. I'm your host, Lauren Epstein. This is 96.7 FM, Arlington, Virginia. And you can reach us on Facebook at You're Hired Radio. You can follow me on Twitter at Lauren Epstein, or you can reach out to me with show ideas at 240-876-0276. Thanks very much. We'll see you next week on You're Hired.